Welcome back to the program. Let's go to line number 1. Good morning, Simon Lono. You're on the air.
Good morning. How are you doing this morning?
I'm fine, thank you. How about you?
I can't complain. You know, you were just talking about Pius X and Harry Constantine.
Yeah.
Man, I haven't heard that name in decades.
I know, it just popped into my head, but he played an active role, man. He drove that van, it was donated by Tommy Woodford, and he drove us to and fro the rink and the soccer pitches all the time. So Harry played a role in that school, no question.
Oh, he was a great man, and you know, I can close my eyes and I see him like it was yesterday.
Yeah, me too. It just popped right in my head because Nathan mentioned support staff, and Harry was certainly supportive of us.
Oh, he certainly was.
Cool.
I wanted to talk about the Bill 29 review.
Let's do it.
I think it's important to know that it was that kind of review that got us where we are today. And let me just explain how that works out. The review of the access to information legislation is supposed to be done every 5 years. It's been the government has just announced a new review 1 year early. The last review started 4 years ago, but Bill 29 was less than 2 years ago. So the question is, what happened in those 2 years between the time the review was done and the time the legislation came out? And that's what I'd like to focus on for a minute, if I could.
Go ahead.
One thing you have to remember is that the last review was done by a gentleman named John Cummings. John Cummings was the former Deputy Minister of the Department of Justice. The reason that's important is because the Department of Justice, as far as the release of information is concerned within government, is the dark empire. Of all departments in government, Department of Justice is the most difficult to get information out, and it has the culture more than any other department of information is on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know it. It is the most shut-down empire in terms of getting information out. And it was the head of that department that government chose to do the review. So he goes off and does the review. He produces a report. The report had some suggestions for stabilizing the system and opening it up a little tiny bit, and also produced a whole bunch of recommendations to close things down even further. That's what was publicly released. That was 4 years ago.
Right.
Government takes that report, and when they produced the legislation, they did two things. First of all, actually three things. First of all, they ignored everything in the report that talked about opening things up a little bit. Second of all, they did introduce and accept every recommendation he had to close things down. And the third thing they did is that they came up with a whole bunch of new ways of closing down information that they came up with on their own, without any public consultation, without any release. They adopted those, and those were a lot of the things that ended up in Bill 29.
Yeah, okay, and so that's how we've arrived where we are. Quick question before we go on to the independent review that's forthcoming. Do you think that Bill 29 has also an exaggerated effect with the electorate, and people refer to virtually anything that has anything to do with accountability as a Bill 29-led issue, even including Nalcor? We know that Bill 29 doesn't affect the operation of that business or the access to their information. Do you think Bill 29 has become as big a political hot potato as a accountability concern?
Well, I think there's sort of two things to that. One is there's no doubt that Bill 29 really did have a profound effect on the way that information is released in the province. But the other side of it, too, is that it also has become a symbol for people. It's become a symbol for the electorate, and it's become a symbol that has just cracked the back of this government. People, an awful lot of people, they don't know exactly what's in Bill 29. If you ask them, if you put a gun to their head, they wouldn't be able to tell you what a single thing was in it. But they have a feeling that government is trying to hide something. They might not necessarily be able to verbalize it, but they have a really bad feeling about it.
That's right, yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So that's how we ended up where we are now. So now government has come out and said, we're going to have another review. We're announcing it a year early. Now there's two things important about this. The first one is, who's going to do the review? And government hasn't talked about that yet. There is a whole bunch of people out there, and I could name half a dozen people, who would be qualified, sensible, responsible, to all parties in conducting that kind of review. So it's very, very important to see who does it. It's also important to see if it's going to be one person or if it's going to be a panel.
Yeah, our understanding at this point is that there's going to be an appointed panel of 3. Now, that hasn't been confirmed, nor any names associated with it, but that's what we think, and it remains to be seen.
And that would be a really good option.
Yeah.
The second thing that's very important is once government receives the report, what do they do with it from there? Because that's where we got ourselves in trouble last time. Because once the report was completed and it went into the bureaucracy, just about every department had a crack at it. And just about every department was annoyed with a particular pathway by which information was released. They wanted to shut it down, and everybody got their little gate put, included in the report. In the final legislation. So that's the thing that needs to be avoided this time around.
The biggest part of this, and the darkest, or the thing that gives most people the most trouble, is the ability for the cabinet ministers in particular, to be able to declare and to classify something as a frivolous request. But then, of course, what they are allowed to conceal as a cabinet secret or a cabinet protected document. I don't know if there's a party of any stripe that's going to have a whole lot of different approach to what goes on inside a cabinet so far as protecting documentation. Do you think, Simon? In reality, I think there's going to be very little to choose between any parties about that particular facet. Your opinion?
Well, I guess to talk about the cabinet documentation piece just for a second. According to the amendments produced by Bill 29, any kind of documentation which contributes to a cabinet decision becomes covered by official secrecy.
Right.
So if this is a real hard example. If a news report, say from the Telegram, gets clipped within the system, gets included in a cabinet document, gets included not even as a cabinet document, but as something a minister reads, which participates in the formation of a decision, that becomes covered. It's a really broad way of defining documents. And the trick, I think, is not to look at what one party would do compared to what another party would do, but to see what one provincial jurisdiction does compared to other provincial jurisdictions. And if you look at Newfoundland compared to, not really Nova Scotia, that's not really a good example, but what they do in Saskatchewan, what they do in Ontario, what they do in Quebec, you'll see that they have far narrower definitions of what's permissible to be released than we do.
They do, and I've had a look at that. I don't know what the practical examples are that is information available in Ontario as opposed to what's here. I think that'll be an important part of this review, is a real direct comparative, not the foolish one that talked to us about being behind developing countries and stuff, because that was misrepresented in an obscene fashion, in my opinion.
Well, that's not relevant to us.
It's not relevant at all, right? And I don't know why, but that was part of what became the political hot potato that is Bill 29, as opposed to the realities of what is doing or not doing. So I think you're right. Let's move on to this review. With the option for a 3-person independent panel, the politics is important, but so is the reality of what comes out of this. If the PCs have any hope of holding on to power and they see Bill 29 as one of the things that's helped unravel their popularity, I would suggest they're probably going to do a pretty solid job in appointing folks who are going to be hard to pick apart or hard to associate a partisan stripe or a negative experience or background with them. This is going to be, if done well politically, forget the realities of what we want to see for information. I've got a funny feeling this is going to be done in a pretty efficient and professional manner. What do you think?
Well, if they pick a sensible panel, and the panel comes back with sensible solutions, sensible recommendations, it's definitely going to be really hard for government this time around to take that report and turn it inside out and close things down even further, or just to ignore it. Because people will be looking at it. And that was one of the things that happened last time, is that the Cummings went out and he and government together, through the process, asked people, do you have a problem with the current system? And people came back and said, no, we don't have a problem. And the way they did that is they just didn't show up.
That's right.
So government took advantage of that situation and produces, Bill 29, and then says, but nobody had any problems, but we didn't know what you were going to do. We didn't know what your plan was. You didn't release that. And so so this time, I think people will be watching it very closely. The media will be watching it very closely, because last time the media, I'm sorry to say, really dropped the ball on it. There was very little coverage of any of this stuff until everything blew up in the House of Assembly.
Yeah, it became the favorite whipping post of many columnists, that's for sure. And I mean, me included, we were all quick to condemn Bill 29 because it went too far to include a variety of things that would never belong in cabinet secrecy or cabinet protection. Just quickly, Simon, once again, the politics of this is important. I mean, the reality of what's available is trumps that, but the politics will play a key role here going forward with the legislation.
Yeah.
So, people are saying there's a legislative fix available here. Why don't the Tories take that and save us the money and whatnot? Now, this is more, I think, partisan drivel. They couldn't possibly go down that road. We are asking the party we don't trust to amend the legislation we don't trust. So this is the only pragmatic approach. Whether or not people choose to forgive the PCs for any past transgressions is up to the individual voter. But there was no other way to do this. Whether or not it was, trying to preemptive strike for the 2015 general election, once again, that's a voter issue and a debate we can have. But there was no other option. If we were going to review, it had to be done in the fashion they're proposing. Whether or not they come through with the right panel and implement the recommendations, we obviously don't know. But this was the only approach, wasn't it?
Well, over the last 18 or 24 months, you've had every member of caucus stand up of the government caucus and say, this is a fine report, it is fine legislation, it does fine things. So how can you expect them to turn around and suddenly come up with recommendations for change now?
Right.
It had to go to an outside panel, and the legislation requires it to go to an outside review.
Yeah, it does, but of course that doesn't have to be a former assistant deputy minister of one of the hardest departments to get information from.
No, it shouldn't. I mean, ideally it would be a judge. I mean, there's a bunch of judges out there who would be very qualified to do this kind of work. There's a bunch of outside agencies where the heads would be great people to do. It would be even useful, I think, to have one of the three panel members to come in from outside the province, someone with a lot of experience in a different system than ours. Because that kind of open window to let in a bit of fresh air would make a big difference.
Do you think that this can help reverse what has been damaging a piece of legislation to the PCs?
Well, I don't know. It has been so damaging that they have a long way to go before they can regain any credibility on this particular subject.
Yes, and this may be a shot in the dark to achieve that, but it was the only play available to the PC. Simon, I'm really glad you have the opportunity these days to call in more frequently. Nice speaking with you.
Take care. Have a good day.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bill 29, boy oh boy, there's no more contentious piece of legislation and politically the most naive legislation that any government in the recent past has put into practice.